Hello, Capture One users, neophytes and acolytes. Oh, I think I've started like that before. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I've had several requests to do a workflow video going through the entire process of an image that I will edit in Capture One in as streamlined a way as possible. Now there's a couple of caveats here that I need to discuss when we're going into when we're editing an image. You do not have to throw absolutely every single tool available in the arsenal that Capture One offers at every single photograph. Some images should only take a minute to edit, some should take half an hour. It's all up to you and how much effort you want to put into the photograph that you are producing. As a bonus, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you a second iteration of this particular image that I've chosen and the edit that I gave to it initially. Depending on the mood that you're in, you're going to find that you might edit your photographs differently 1 week to the next. And there's nothing wrong with that. So don't expect to find absolutely every single tool used in this particular example. If you like the concept of doing these full edits on an image, please let me know in the comments section below, as if I get enough feedback, I will do more of these. Okay, so let's take a look at the photograph itself. I'm going to start off first by analyzing the photograph. Now, a lot of photographers don't necessarily look at their photograph and decide what they're wanting to do with it before they start editing. This, to me, though, is an important part of the process of producing your images. It's a good idea to take a look at the photograph before you've started and try and work out in your mind's eye what you think you should do to the photograph itself. And interestingly, Capture One actually has a really cool tool for that, and it's called the annotations tool, which you will find by going to Window and you will say create floating tool, and you can find annotations up near the top. You can add that to any one of your usual tool tabs, and at the moment I have it at the top of my library over here. And we'll take a look at this photograph that was taken in a quiver tree forest just to the north of Keetmanshoop on a Nature's Light workshop. Now, if you're interested in joining one of our workshops, and when I say our, it's myself and several other photographers who run workshops through Nature's Light in various parts of Africa, there's a link in the top right hand corner to take you through to the web page. Considering this image, if I look at the photograph, you can see that it is immediately noticeable how orange this is. Now, it was photographed with sunny white balance, so around 5200 Kelvin on a Nikon D850 camera. Essentially, the light itself was actually quite orange with a bit of magenta. It is twilight, the sun has gone down, that's just the last sort of warmth on the horizon that you're starting to see washing over the quiver trees themselves. If I look at the photograph initially, I think I'm going to do something with the white balance, as I find it is a little bit too orange. So I'm probably going to take a look at the white balance, and I think that should be adjusted slightly so that we can get some more of the blue inside the sky itself. We're going to look at some of the blue in the sky itself, and we're just going to make sure that that sky is looking a little bit more natural and less orangey and slightly polluted in a way. Then looking at the trees themselves, I'm wanting to brighten these up a little bit. So we're going to brighten up our trees along here just so that they stand out a touch. And we're also probably going to try and bring out some more texture inside those trees. So texture and brighten. Something else that I quite like is the grass in the foreground, and at the moment it seems that the grass itself is kind of lost in all of this orangeness. So we're going to try and brighten up some of the grass itself, I feel. We have some issues that I can see over here. I'm going to get rid of these little bits of light over there, and I notice there's also some little red line over here which might need to be dealt with. So that's all with the healing stuff that I'm going to be dealing with. I also feel like the crop doesn't necessarily work at the moment, so this is distracting on the left hand side of the image, so I'm probably going to try and crop that in. So we're looking at a crop something along the lines of that, maybe a smidgen off the bottom, and I suspect just pull that in a little bit like so. Those are the primary edits I'm likely to do. I'd also like to take a look at some of these greens and just bring them out potentially a little bit inside the tree so that we've got some separation in terms of the tones themselves. So these are the adjustments that I would like to make to my image, and we're going to start by going through from the base. We're going to start with the basic edits of the image itself, and we're going to use a layered approach to be able to apply each of those edits to the photograph until we reach essentially an image that I'm happy with. Okay, so we've now looked at our photograph and we've worked out the changes that we're going to want to make to that photo. We're going to go back into the adjust tabs and the shape and the style and everything, but first, to be able to get rid of your annotations and not actually see them, all you need to do is hit the V button or get away from the annotation tool itself. The default shortcut for the annotation tool, incidentally, is I, as in info. One of the first places that most people will look at in terms of their photographs and making sure that they are the way they like is to first go and look at the style itself. Now, I tend to start in the base characteristics of the image, and I would suggest using Pro Standard Color Space or the ICC profile, as I find it does tend to have a slightly larger color gamut that you're working with. The curve, it usually sets as a default by auto, but you can actually quickly cycle through them and you can find something that you prefer. So I quite like the film standard. I think it gives a nice good contrast punch to the photograph. I like the color that's coming through. The oranges have actually intensified now, but we're going to deal with that in a moment. In terms of the shape, a good place to start as well is to consider what's happening to the photograph itself based on the lens that you're going to be using. I was using a 12mm Laowa lens over here, so we have extreme width happening inside this photograph. There's not that much distortion though, so you'll see that as I pull my distortion slider out, it might tweak it a little bit. So I do feel like it could use just a little bit of anti-barrel distortion. So I'm going to pull that out a little bit. I'm not going to change my light fall off because I actually do want a little bit of a vignette happening inside the photograph. And then this sharpness slider does actually help. I'm going to pull that out just a touch because it'll bring in some of the sharpness that's sometimes lost due to diffraction limitation on the lens itself. The rest of the adjustments in this particular image I'm going to ignore. I don't feel like I need to do any keystone correction. I actually quite like the feeling of looking up into the trees at the moment. So we're going to go from shape now and jump into adjust. And importantly, the first starting point for most of my images is that I find the correct white and black point. Now you can do this by using your auto adjust. So for instance, I could go through and I find that the levels and the remove dust and the exposure are good ones to use for the auto adjust. But for the time being, I'm going to do this just with my sliders. So if I take a look at my levels slider, I can pull that all the way back to the point where I can see my white point. If you're worried about clipping, you can hit Command E, which will switch on your exposure warning over here. That means that if I were to push this too far, you'll see how you get an exposure warning coming up where the highlights are now blown. I want to get the brightness in the photograph without actually blowing out any of the highlights in my sky itself. This has brought the brightness of the image to a much more satisfactory level in my opinion. I did mention that white balance was an issue when I was looking at the initial photograph. It was a little bit too orange. Now the reason why I've changed my levels first is that you sometimes don't see the effects that color is having on the photograph until you have a better exposure. By finding my black and my white point, I've now got a far better exposure in my photograph. So now what I will do is play with my Kelvin to get that color back in the sky where I want a bit of blue. There we go, that's better. I've just smidgened my tint back slightly towards the green because I find that there was a slight magenta cast to the image itself. This might be because I had a 3-stop neutral density filter on it, which sometimes does introduce some magenta to the photograph itself. As you can see, I haven't even needed to touch the exposure for the time being. I can potentially add a little bit of contrast, but I think I'd rather do that using my curve in a moment. What I do want to do though is bring some saturation out because I do know that there's going to be more color in the final photograph. So I'm bringing the saturation out and I'm just going to open up the brightness just a touch. Brightness is doing much of what the gamma slider or the middle gray slider would have done inside the levels. There is always more than one way to basically do the same thing inside the photograph itself. Importantly, I said that I wanted to bring out more detail and color inside the grass itself. One of the easiest ways to identify that grass is to go down to my color editor, find the advanced tab, use my color picker, find some grass, and then switch off the view selected color range or switch on the view selected color range. And you can see at the moment there's a lot of color that's been selected. So we actually need to narrow that down, which I will do by using the sliders on my tool there. It's still too much. We want to identify just those yellows. So I'm going to bring that back up towards the yellows. There we go, that's better. Don't need the shadows. Okay, this has identified the yellows quite nicely. Unfortunately, it has also identified some of the texture inside the bark itself, which I don't want to work on just yet. That's fine, because what I'm now going to do is create a layer based on my color selection that I've chosen over here. So I'm going to click on the contextual menu, the three dots to the side, and say create masked layer from selection. This will then create a layer, which you can see is already masked out over here. I have my mask visible. I'm going to hit M so that you can't see the mask visibility, and we can also rename this. So if I go to my layers and masks, I'm going to call this my grass. Switching back on my mask, you'll see that it is highlighted red. I want to remove the trees from this. So the easiest way to do that is to use your magic eraser. So I'm just going to grab that and it'll automatically select. Oopsie. Okay, unfortunately it has actually taken away the grass itself. So let's try the AI selector first. That's actually much better, and that'll then erase the tree from my mask itself. There's this tree here as well, can go, and potentially these rocks as well, which I'll probably crop out anyway. Right, so now my grass is selected, which I'm much happier with over here. I'm going to go out of my mask at the moment, and we are going to use the curves tool to just lighten the grass just a touch. There we go. And add some contrast around the grass itself. We want essentially to see some of that last afternoon light basically wisping across the grass itself. I do feel we could warm it up just a touch, so I'm going to take my Kelvin on that layer and just warm that up just a little bit, so we're getting that whole lovely orange and blue or orange and teal look to the photograph at the moment. It's a good idea to go into your mask as well and just right click and then say refine mask, which will then just make sure that your edges are nicely smoothed out between the different sections. So I'm going to say apply, and you can see the before and after with the grass just by clicking on that layer over here. The next area we want to work on is going to be the actual trees themselves. So I'm going to create a new layer over here, and we're going to use our AI selection tool. So click on that, and we're going to select our trees. And you can see by hitting my mask tool how accurate that selection is. It's really, really good. Okay, so we have our selection for our trees in place, and I wanted to get some color in the tree as well as some texture coming out from the tree itself. One of the easiest ways to build texture in a photograph is by using your curve tool. You can actually just add a bit of contrast to the photo. There we go. That's it, and that's going to bring that out nicely. And again, it's a good way to just go before and after to be able to see the photo itself. So we should also rename that as trunks of trees. There you go. The orange is maybe a little intense at the moment, but we'll deal with that now. I'd also like to bring the brightness up just a touch over there. And let's just reduce some of the orange inside here. So we'll go again to our color editor, grab the picker, put it onto the orange, and just bring the saturation of the oranges back ever so slightly. If you find that the effect is too strong, just use your opacity slider on the layer itself to bring it back just a touch. Remember, subtle is important. At this point, it's a good idea to just take a look at your before and after. As you can see, there's already a massive difference that's happening here. And I'd also like to get some more blue in the sky itself over here. So I'm going to create a new filled layer. So you go to layers, hold and press, and you say new filled adjustment layer. I want to take a color picking from the color sky over here, and we're going to smooth that out and potentially add a bit more color and light to that. We want to select all of those blues basically. There we go, that's looking better. Right, so we have the full sky selected. I'm going to switch off my view selected color range over here. And then what we're going to do is just push some saturation into that sky. And we can also change the hue ever so slightly down to the greens and the blues. Smoothness is up nice and high. And we can take our lightness down just a touch. Okay, to see your before and after, just touch your layer over there, and you get an idea of how that looks. I'm a little concerned about this band of brightness in the middle over here as well, which I find is a little too bright. So using my high dynamic range section, I'm going to take my highlights and just bring that down a touch. Just darkened it ever so slightly. So we're now getting some nice interesting color effects between the oranges in the foreground and the blue and the purples in the background. We did want to lighten up our greens just a touch over here as well. So I will zoom in to where I know I have some green inside my photograph. And once more, we're going to grab our color picker. And we're going to select a green. And you can see there it is over here. Let's use our view selected color range to be able to identify where that is. Pull that out towards the greens, reduce my yellows over there, and there's my selection, which is looking very neat of just that area. It has also selected my grasses. That's not necessarily going to be a problem because we're once more going to use our contextual menu and say create mask layer from selection. And I'm going to rename that as flowers so that I can keep a tab on what's happening in between my layers. We're just going to lighten that up just a touch and increase our saturation of the flowers. But now notice that it is also affecting my grasses. So what we actually want to do is go back into what our mask was and erase everything except the flowers. So I'm just going to grab a standard eraser over here, make sure that it's set to opacity and flow of 100/100. And erase out everything that we don't need. And because the flowers are all nicely selected up at the top, it's actually quite easy just to pull out everything that we didn't need over there. And there we go. So I now have the flowers. Again, I do think that's a little too strong, so I'm going to pull that back just about 10% or so. I still want to finish up the crop so that it looks a bit more effective, so I'm going to go to my crop tool. I personally prefer using an unconstrained crop because I don't feel like I want to be constrained by the borders of some defined aspect ratio. And besides, I kind of like the more letterbox approach to a lot of my images. So I'm going to right click and I will then go to make sure that it is on unconstrained, and I'm going to pull that in a bit over there, pull this up, pull this into the rock from the rock over here, right to the edge there, and I think it needs to be there just a touch. I also strongly suspect that it needs to be rotated ever so slightly. There we go, right. And I'm going to press enter, and I'm much happier with that particular composition. Right, the things that I still am bothered by are these little bits of light that you can see in the foreground over here. So I'm going to zoom into 100%, shortcut key Alt Command 0. And we are going to deal with this red line and this little light in the background. The light is nice and easy. I'm just going to hit J, which is going to bring up my healing brush. I've set that as my particular shortcut, and then holding down my Alt or Option button, I'm going to select a source point and I'm going to just cover that up over there. Okay, then similarly, I'm going to use my healing tool and we're going to use the Alt button and just get rid of that little bit of red from a road and this little touch over there. There we go. Hit the V button to be able to see where your changes are, and that looks pretty good. All right. If you're worried about dust spots or anything like that, chances are they've already been gotten rid of by doing your auto adjust over here by using remove dust. If you're worried about dust spots, you can also use the tip that I gave in a previous video on obliterating dust, where I use a new style and I've set it to a shortcut key where I go Command 1, and I then get a new layer on top of all of my other layers, which says visualize dust, and then another heal layer for doing the actual healing of that. As you can see from this image though, there aren't any dust spots immediately apparent inside the photograph, so I don't need to worry about that. Those little blips of light are stars because late afternoon photographs. So I'm just going to remove the visualize dust layer and that heal layer, and anything else we need to do still over here. I will probably do one. Okay, yeah, that's looking good. Okay, then now that we've reached this stage, it's the last tweaks to the photograph itself. So I'm going to create one final top layer over here. So I'm going to say add new filled adjustment layer. I think it needs a little bit more detail to the photograph. So I'll take my clarity slider and push that out just a touch over here. I'm also going to zoom in. I'm going to go to our sharpening tool, refine. I'll go to sharpening. We're just going to bring that out just a small amount to bring out a little bit more detail inside the photograph. Take my radius down, make sure that there's no issues with our halos. It doesn't need noise reduction. As you can see, it's pretty smooth, all of the background over here. There's no noise or anything. One thing I do need to be aware of though is, because it was a longer exposure of about a minute, there might be hot pixels evident inside the photograph. I don't really see anything at the moment, but if you are worried, just go through to noise reduction, make sure that you are on your base layer. So let me just go down to my base layer over here, image layer, and then just take single pixel and push that over to the right hand side. And what that does is it removes all the hot pixels inside the photograph. Miraculously, it seems to manage to not misidentify stars as hot pixels, so that's fine. The final tweak to this last layer is also to go through to my vignette, which would be right at the bottom, vignetting, and I think it does need just a little bit more of a vignette over here, right, because I want to get that last evening light feel to the photograph itself. And there we go. If we take a look at the before and after, this is the before photograph and this is my after photograph. Now, importantly, there's a whole range of other things that I could have done to the photograph. This is not necessarily the only way that this image can be edited, and your personal preferences and tastes towards an image change from week to week as well. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, here is a version of the photograph that I edited previously, and you can see that it is somewhat different to the photograph that I've just created. It's the same file, just with a slightly different edit. The edit in this case as well was finished in Nik FX, where I used a Gaussian blur and detail extractor as well. So the two images are very different. In the comments below, let me know which one you prefer. Which do you think is a stronger photograph? And I'm fairly sure there's actually going to be a mixed reaction to this. Some people will prefer this version, while others will prefer the slightly more chocolate box version, for want of better words. Okay, so that's it. If you have enjoyed this video, please remember to put a like and a subscribe inside the various boxes around the screen. If you like the concept of doing these images where I take a raw image and I edit it all the way through to completion in Capture One, again, please let me know and I can do more of them in future. Until then, good luck with your own photographs. Drop any more suggestions down below, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Till then, cheers.